Hi class, hope everyone's doing well. I just wanted to quickly go over Module 6 on classes. So in this module, you'll be learning how to recognize the role of methods in accessing and modifying data in classes. So we talked about this briefly in another video, but this is the idea of using what are called mutator and accessor methods. So this allows you to modify and access attributes of a class. They're also called setter and getter methods. So mutator and accessor methods can also be called setter and getter methods. This allows you to have more control over modifying and accessing the attributes of a class. And then you'll go over writing methods for a collection class for a collection manager program and writing methods for an item class for a collection manager program. You'll be specifically doing this for your Stepping Stone Lab 5, which is also in this module. So in Stepping Stone Lab 5, you'll be working with the recipe class, and you'll be using a recipe test class to actually create this collection class, which will use the recipe class. So you'll be working with multiple classes in your application for the Stepping Stone Lab 5. And I'll go over this more in a little bit. So you also, as usual, be doing your zyBooks reading and activities. You'll be going over chapters 9 and 10. You'll have one assignment, Stepping Stone Lab 5. So for chapter 9, you'll be going over methods. You'll be going over methods with branches and loops. You'll be doing unit testing for methods. So this is important to actually test the methods that you create and make sure they work as expected. And you can test them in the main method of your class. You'll go over how methods work. And you'll go over common errors that come up when working with methods. So in chapter 10, you'll be working with mutators, accessors, and private helpers. So again, this is how the methods that you can use to actually access and modify the private attributes of a class and allow you to have control how they're accessed and modified. Then you'll go over constructors. So when you create an instance of a class, you call the constructor of that class. So this is always called when you create the initial instance of the class. So then you can do constructor overloading, which allows you to pass in parameters when you create an instance of the class. So you'll be going over these things in chapters 9 and 10 and practicing them for the Stepping Stone Lab 5. And this is also moving you closer to completing your final project. So let's go over Stepping Stone Lab 5. Okay, for Stepping Stone Lab 5, you'll be doing something slightly different. Before, you've been working with single class applications, right? You've been turning in one Java file, just creating one class. So in this lab, you'll be working with a full-fledged application, working with multiple classes. So specifically, you'll be working with the recipe class, then creating an additional class that's going to test the recipe class. Okay, and then it's important to review the completed code for Stepping Stone Lab 4 for many reasons. It can help you to see how you can improve on your writing your code, commenting, whatever it may be, and also just helps to kind of serve as a foundation for this Stepping Stone Lab 5 and future Stepping Stone Labs. And it's also important to make sure you understand Stepping Stone Lab 4 as it's going to be used as you build toward your final project. Okay, so in this Stepping Stone Lab, you'll notice you'll be creating a recipe, and part of that will be creating an array list of ingredients. So it's only required to create an array list of ingredient names. However, you want to think about how this is going to move towards your final project. And for your final project, you're not just going to have an array list of ingredient names as strings, an array list of strings storing the ingredient names. You're also going to have an array list, or you're instead going to have an array list of ingredient objects, right? You're going to have an array list of an ingredient object which consists of not just the ingredient name, but the ingredient amount, the calories, etc. So you actually want to, it's ideal, although not required, but I highly recommend that you create an array list of ingredient objects opposed to just the ingredient names as strings. So in order to do this, you're going to have to use your additional ingredient class in your project. So that means you'd have 3 different classes, right? Your ingredient class, your recipe class, and the recipe test class that tests the recipe class. Okay, so you want to pay attention to this UML diagram for the recipe class as you work toward this work to finish this lab, and just think about how all of these methods will be incorporated within the recipe class. So in this Stepping Stone Lab assignment, you will be asking the user to input the recipe name, the serving size, and you're going to use the ingredient entry code from Stepping Stone Lab 4 to actually add ingredients to the recipe. Then you're going to calculate the calories per serving. And then additionally, you're going to create your first custom method to print the recipe to the screen. And again, it says that you want to work with just the ingredient name. However, I strongly recommend that you add ingredient objects, which consist of not just the name, but the other properties of an ingredient, right? And then you'll be saving those properties, storing them as an actual ingredient object, right? That will be part of an ingredient object, and you'll be adding this ingredient object to an array. So you have an array list of ingredients, opposed to an array list of strings, only storing the ingredient name. Okay, so specifically for this lab, you'll want to do these three things. First, you want to create instance variables for the class, for the recipe class, which consists of the recipe name, serving size, and recipe ingredients. So you want to think of what data types are going to be needed to store these attributes for the recipe class. You also want to create accessor and mutator methods for each of these attributes. So you'll learn about this inside of the Zybooks reading. So you want to be able to make sure you create accessor and mutator methods. You also want to create constructors, so create the appropriate constructors for the recipe class. And then finally, you want to make sure you print extra details for the recipe. And you'll be creating a custom method to print the recipe out to the console. So those are the main things that you want to include for this Stepping Stone Lab 5. And so you're going to actually test the functionality of the recipe class by working with the recipe test.java file. So this is an additional class that's going to be used to actually test your recipe class. And then finally, you want to make sure that you're going to replace the main method within the Stepping Stone Lab 5 recipe class. You want to replace it with create new recipe. So this is important because your project, your full application is only going to have one point of entry, one main method that it's going to run from. And this is going to be the recipe test main method, right? This is going to be what you're going to be running. And this recipe test is going to be testing the recipe class. So the recipe class does not need a main method. It's just going to have all the attributes and methods associated with the recipe, but then in the recipe test class, you can actually have a main method that tests all of these things. Okay, and then you can extend this lab for your final project. Again, part of this involves, instead of storing an array list of ingredient name only, so instead of having just an array list of strings storing the ingredient name within a recipe, instead you can store an array list of ingredient objects, and an ingredient object will hold multiple attributes for that ingredient, including the ingredient name, as well as the measurement type, the amount, in calories. Okay, so that's Stepping Stone Lab 5. So again, remember you're working with, at the minimum, two classes, the recipe class and the recipe test class. And I highly recommend that in your recipe class you take advantage of, for storing the ingredients, you don't just have an array list of strings which store the ingredient name, but you have an array list of ingredient objects. And this will require you to have an additional third class, which will be your actual ingredient class. So when you're submitting your Stepping Stone Lab 5, you should at least be submitting two .java files, the recipe.java and the recipe test.java. And again, if you do work with the ingredient object, an array list of ingredient objects, then you're going to need an additional third .java file for the ingredient class. Okay, so let's look at the code, the template for Stepping Stone Lab 5. Okay, so first let's look at how we can incorporate, bring in the recipe test Java and recipe Java files into our project. So assume we have our project already. We've created it, Stepping Stone Labs. So now we're going to actually import the recipe test and recipe Java files. So you see here of all the Stepping Stone Lab files, we want two of them. So the recipe.java and recipe test.java. So we're just going to drag them over, put them in source packages, and here they are. So there's a few things we need to fix. So we've showed this in a previous video. So notice, so let's open them up. So let's look at the recipe.java file first. Notice, we have this error with the Stepping Stones package. So that's because it's not under the name, a package called Stepping Stones. So let's create a Stepping Stones package so that this error is removed. So if we right click, we can say create new Java package, and we're going to call it the same name as the package here, Stepping Stones. Okay, finish. So we have the Stepping Stones package, so now we can just drag both of these .java files into this package. And we could say move without refactoring, click OK. And there we go. So now we have this new Stepping Stones package and we have both files under it. And you can notice the error went away. So in the recipe test.java file, the error did not go away because we need to make sure we put the package Stepping Stones at the top. So let's move this to the top, and there we go. So now the error went away for that one as well. So we also have errors under the class name. So that's because the class name needs to match the actual name of the file seen here. So we can change the name of the file here. So if we right click on the .java file, go to properties, and we can change the name. So Stepping Stone 5 underscore recipe test. So we want to make sure this is the exact same name as the class. So we want to click on it, press enter, and we want to rename without refactoring. Okay. So if we go to our recipe test class, you can notice the error went away there. Okay, good. And then let's also look at this one. So let's change this name for recipe class properties, and we change this to the exact same name as the class. Enter, rename without refactoring, OK. And there we go. So the error went away there as well. So let's review the recipe class. So again, the recipe class, you're going to first instantiate the instance variables for the class. So the recipe name is given to you. So you're going to also create these three variables, the servings, number of servings. So you have to determine what data type you'll need for that. Also an array list of the recipe ingredients. So this can be a string array, an array list of strings. But again, I highly recommend that you use an array list of ingredient objects. Then you also need a variable for storing the total recipe calories. Okay, and you'll also be creating mutator and accessor methods for each of these variables. So remember, these mutator and accessor variables are important for, mutator and accessor methods are important for encapsulation, the idea of encapsulation. So this idea that you want to keep your instance variables private and have control over how they are accessed and modified. So if you want to do validation or formatting when they're being modified, you can control that in the mutator and accessor methods rather than having the user or whoever's accessing these variables have direct access to the actual variables. So you want them to be able to access them only through the mutator and accessor methods, which you can control within the implementation of these methods. So you also need the constructors. So constructors you'll learn about in this module, but the constructors always have the exact same name as the class. So notice these names are the exact same. So when you actually create an instance of the class, which you'll be doing in recipe test.java in that class, when you create an instance of this recipe class, if you create an instance and do not pass in any parameters, it's going to call this constructor. So it always calls this constructor when you create an instance of a class. So initially instantiate the class. So it'll actually implement whatever is inside of this constructor method. So if you do, there's also constructor overloading, which allows you to pass in parameters. So it's another
constructor method, also with the same name, and it's overloaded. It has parameters, so these additional parameters that you can pass in when you instantiate or create an instance of the class inside of another class. So when you create an instance of the class recipe test, you can also pass in parameters directly, which will set the attributes of the recipe object. Okay, and then you implement it as well within the method. So in this case, this overloaded constructor will create the recipe name, servings, recipe ingredients, and total recipe calories, and these are the values that are passed in as parameters when creating an instance of the class. And it's important to note that you'll notice that there's this .recipe name, this .servings, this .recipe ingredients, this .recipe calories. This is related to referring to the actual instance variables of the class. So when you see this .recipe name, is referring to the recipe name variable, instance variable. And this recipe name is referring to the variable that's passed in as an input. Okay. So then you're going to be creating the print recipe method. So this is a method which will print out the recipe information. Then finally, you're going to have your main method. So your main method, you'll notice there's these question marks. You want to make sure that you replace these question marks with the appropriate code. So you want to make sure you include the appropriate data type and appropriate value that you're initializing it to. So you'll see these question marks throughout the code, and you want to make sure you place them with the appropriate code. So in this main method, you're going to be creating the actual recipe and asking the user for the recipe name, for the servings, number of servings for the recipe, for the all the ingredients. So you have a do while loop that continuously asks the user for each ingredient until they say end and they're done entering ingredients. So again, you can, as they enter ingredients, you can either store this in an array list of strings, so just the ingredient name in an array list of strings, or you can actually create, which I highly recommend again, to create an array list of ingredient objects. So as they're entering the attributes of the ingredient, you store that inside of, you create a new ingredient object that uses those attributes, rather than just creating an array list of strings storing the ingredient name only. Okay, so you'll also be wanting to calculate the total recipe calories. So as the users entering in ingredients, they're entering the number of calories for that ingredient. So you're going to continuously accumulate the total calories from the ingredient and store that in total recipe calories. So at each iteration of this loop, you're going to get the ingredient calories for the current ingredient and add that to total recipe calories. Okay, and you're going to have to make sure you compute for each ingredient the total number of calories for that ingredient and then add that to total recipe calories. Okay, and then finally here to test this, you're going to actually create a new recipe and you're going to use the constructor that passes in parameters, and then you're going to print out the recipe calling your print recipe method that you created up here. So this is for testing. And again, eventually, as noted in the guidelines, you're going to want to, after you test this, make sure it works. You're going to want to change this main method to be create new recipe. You're going to change this to a method called create new recipe. So this is good, keeping as main for initial testing, making sure everything works. But once it works, you're going to want to change this to create new recipe so that it can be called, so that this method can be called within the recipe test class. And so when you change it to create new recipe, instead of just creating a new recipe and printing it out, you're going to want to create the recipe and then return the recipe. So this recipe method, create new recipe method, is going to return the actual recipe object. Okay, so for the recipe test class, you're going to actually be testing the recipe class that you created. And all the code is pretty much laid out for you. There's a few things you might need to modify. The idea here is that you're going to be creating two recipes, pizza and ramen. So you have two recipes called my second recipe and my first recipe. So what you're going to be doing is, so you instantiate the my first recipe. This is going to be using the default constructor that doesn't pass in any parameters. So then you're going to create an array list of ingredients for both both recipes. So recipe ingredients 2 or 1, so recipe ingredients, and the recipe ingredients 2. So notice that this is an array list of ingredient objects. So this is highly recommended to do it this way. However, it's not required. This can be an array list of strings which stores the ingredient names opposed to the actual ingredient objects. But I do recommend leaving it this way and incorporating the ingredient object. So then you're going to be creating the ingredient name, and then you're going to be adding this ingredient. So if you are using an ingredient object, you're going to be adding this new ingredient. So by passing in ingredient name to this method, add new ingredient, which returns an actual ingredient object. You're storing this as temp ingredient. And then you're adding this temp ingredient to the recipe ingredients list. Now if you're doing strings and you're just storing the ingredient name, you won't need this, right? You won't actually need to create a new ingredient object. You'll just be adding the ingredient name to the recipe ingredients list. Okay, then for the my second recipe, this you're using the constructor which we overloaded. So it's, this constructor basically allows you to pass in parameters. So we're creating this second recipe by directly passing in the parameters of the recipe into the constructor. So you're passing in the pizza at the recipe name, the servings, which is 2, the recipe ingredients list, which we created here, right? The anchovies, that which we added as a new ingredient and passed into the recipe ingredients list. So we're passing in that list here, and then this is the total number of calories, 300. So we created this my second recipe and directly passed in its attributes through this constructor, which passes in parameters. So then we, for the first recipe, we create a second ingredient name 2, noodles. And again, we create a new ingredient object, and then we add it to the second ingredient, recipe ingredients list. So recipe ingredients 2. And again, this can be just a string that you're adding to the recipe ingredients list, which will be the ingredient name, noodles. Okay, so then for the my first recipe, you're actually going to be calling the setter methods to set the attributes of that recipe. So you call set recipe name, set servings, set recipe ingredients, and set total recipe calories, and you pass in the appropriate attributes, the appropriate values for each of these setter methods. And then you're going to print out the recipe for both my first recipe and my second recipe, and you're going to print it out using the print recipe method. And that's it. So this is mostly given to you. So this is good for actually testing your recipe class. I also suggest you to test the create new recipe, which you'll be creating here when you change this from main to create new recipe in your recipe class. I highly suggest you to test that out also in recipe test. Although it's not required, it's good to test and make sure your recipe class works as expected. Okay, so that is everything for Stepping Stone Lab 5. So if you have any questions, please let me know, and always remember to complete your written code reflection as well. So for this Stepping Stone Lab, you'll be submitting your written code reflection and then all the Java files for this application, which includes recipe.java, Stepping Stone 5, recipe.java, Stepping Stone 5, recipe test.java, and additionally the ingredient.java if you're going to use the ingredient object within the as an array list within your project, opposed to just an array list of strings. Okay, so that is everything for Stepping Stone Lab 5. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.